Thank you for coming to this short little presentation here of one crime novelist's take on how he writes a particular crime novel. I want to thank Rosie and Paul for the invitation, Tom Olner, who I've known and from the past, and this basically is pretty informal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the books and how I research them and some of the research tools that I use. But if you have any questions at any time, I'm certainly at the end. I'll save time for some questions. But if you have questions before that, feel free to ask them. I have a really good memory, but it's short. So, if you think of something when I'm talking and you don't want to wait, just raise your hand and we'll go ahead and answer it. And it can be on this particular topic or just about anything about writing and my background and so on, which I'll talk a little bit about. I was in education for over 20 years. I was a teacher, English teacher actually, I got a major in English, and then I got a master's degree in learning disabilities, special education. I worked with learning disabled students and kids with behavior problems. I eventually got an administrative degree and became a principal. I was a principal in White Bear Lake, Minnesota for 7 years. And then I became an associate professor teaching in the Graduate School of Education at St. Mary's University in Minneapolis. And I was teaching teachers who were in the master's program, working on their master's degrees. And I did that for 15 years. I was actually principaling and teaching there at the same time. Dual work. But I always wrote. And I wrote some short stories that were published and things, and I never had a novel published. And 20 years ago now, I met my wife, Martha, from Colombia, South America. And she said to me one day, she said, you always are writing stories and books and things. And she said, why don't you write about, and you like mysteries, why don't you write about a Colombian detective? So I started to turn that idea over in my mind, and that led me to write the first book in this series with this homicide detective called John Santana, who was part of the St. Paul Police Department. And that first book was White Tombs, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But let me talk about the whole mystery genre itself for just a moment. The mystery genre is a really big tent or big umbrella, and underneath that umbrella are mysteries such as cozies. That's the lady that lives in a small town and knits and solves murders, right? It was the Jessica Fletcher character on a TV series. I don't remember what the name of that was, but Murder, She Wrote, right, exactly. So, you have that type. You have a sort of the psychological mystery. Jonathan Kellerman writes a lot about that. James Patterson did some of those. But what I write is called a police procedural. And basically this is pretty much of a straightforward definition of what a police procedural is. It's basically a crime novel where the emphasis is on the procedures used by police in solving the crime. So in each of the books start with a murder, and you see what Santana sees. You see, how the forensic works and that sort of thing, and then you work the case with Santana. And I think with all good crime books, it's never what it appears to be. There's always something below the surface there or beyond what the murder scene looks like and or appears like. So that's basically what a police procedural is. I've written 6 police procedurals, all right? And we'll talk a little bit about the research and about each one of them in a moment. I mentioned White Tombs. The Black Minute came out about 2009. Bad Weeds Never Die, then Bone Shadows, Death's Way, and the latest book, The Darkness Hunter, came out in just this September 1st. And actually, much of it takes place here in Red Wing, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Now, your typical, as I'm listening to Mike and I'm listening to and talking with a lot of police officers, most officers, fortunately, don't have to use violence or use their gun in situations. Many of them, and the ones that I've talked to anyway, have never drawn their gun through their whole career, and that's a good thing. But that doesn't necessarily make an exciting action thriller police procedural, fortunately. And most criminals, aren't the brightest bulbs in the package. So again, I'm reminded of the crook that came into the 7-Eleven and bought something and then decided to rob the clerk and took off but left his driver's license with the clerk. It wasn't too hard to track that person down. Or the guy that just gets stopped for speeding, and police officer comes over and politely asks for the license, and he says, what is it with you people? He said, can't you get your act together? Yesterday you took my license away, and now today you're asking to see it again. I mean, what is the deal? So, But again, so a lot of the criminals, quote unquote, that are in these books are, it's a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated than that. One of the first things, and again, a lot of these are really hard to see, and I apologize. I have a lot of forensic and crime scene books that are written by experts, and the reason for that is I attempt to try and do or be as accurate as I can when it comes to the murder scene, when it comes to the forensics. And if I have questions, I usually can talk to someone from the St. Paul Police Department or Minneapolis, or connections or contacts that I have to kind of get their take on how it should be. All right, so whether it's gunshot wounds, crime scene investigation, forensic pathology, criminal poisoning, and a host of others, these are textbooks that I have. They're filled with photos, many of them not the the easiest to look at, but it gives you an idea as a novelist as to how it should be. I mean, for example, in gunshot wounds, is it a contact shot? Is it a close contact shot? Is it, how many feet away, or so on? And a lot of that they can tell by the stippling or the burn marks or whatever on the, on the wound. So those are things, again, that I work with. I mentioned the first book was White Tombs, and that came out in 2008. And at the time, the St. Paul Police Department was housed in the old public safety building. That was before the new law enforcement center was built in St. Paul. How many of you been? Any of you been down to St. Paul, the law enforcement center? I'm sure anybody with a police background has. But at that time, there was a huge conflict between the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department and the St. Paul Police Department, because they were going to put both those departments in the building, okay? And, they're going to have one shooting range, and they were going to have, and frankly, the St. Paul PD was very worried at the time that somehow they'd be absorbed into the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department. So there was a great debate going on, to the extent that, how many remember the Republican convention that was here in town a few years back, right? Big deal, a lot of security, whatnot. Well, when I toured the new law enforcement center, I went up to the top floor, and there's a huge room up there that's completely empty. And I said, well, what's this? What was supposed to be in here? And they said, well, this was going to be the communications center, dispatch, okay? But the Ramsey County Department and the St. Paul PD couldn't agree on how that was going to be managed and conducted. So what they did was they built a skyway across the street, and the dispatch center is across the street in another building. So that room was empty. Well, during the convention, that's where all the security and Secret Service and everything were housed up there in that floor because they had an empty space up there. So oftentimes you hear people say, well, this is a cliche, that the bureaucracies in department. Well, it's a cliche because basically that's the way it is oftentimes. Departments, unfortunately, and I think there's a lot of work going on particularly with the federal department, the FBI, and local law enforcement trying to share information. Somebody, FBI coming in, taking over the case, that, I always hear about those kinds of things. Well, that's because it does happen, and people get very frustrated with that. So I was fortunate to get a tour of that old building at the time, and so that conflict is mentioned in White Tombs between the Ramsey County Sheriffs and the St. Paul Police Department. I was also able to go through the Citizens Academy, where I rode with the police officers. I shot the Glocks. We did sim training, where you're in this place at night and you had to go in to see if you should shoot or not shoot, those kind of simulations. It was really intense. I remember I rode one night with an officer, or a Ramsey County Sheriff, who had a dog, and a German Shepherd. And that was a fascinating ride. And they did a demonstration for me that night. They sent a guy out, in one of those heavy suits, with the cover, and he hid. And they took the dog out of the car, and the first thing they said is empty, and the Shepherd emptied, because they don't want the dog looking for a place to go to bat. They want him focused on the scent. And it was dark, and that dog tracked that guy right down into the woods and into the trees and pinned him against, and barked. He didn't attack, but he pinned him against a tree until we all showed up. So, it was really fascinating. And my own dog, we have a golden retriever. Actually, she's just 6 months old now. And Santana has a dog, a retriever called Gypsy, Gitana in Spanish, and we named her Gypsy. And that's what I use for her when we take her out at night or whatever. I just tell her to empty, and she's learned pretty good. Not in the house, but outside. So I met Tim Lynch, the homicide commander at the time from the St. Paul PD. He's retired now. Went through the old adult detention center that was on the corner of Kellogg down there in Wabasha. And because my wife was Colombian, the whole backstory in this book is told what happened to Santana when he was 16, what happened to his family, and how he came here as a 16-year-old and eventually became a homicide detective for St. Paul PD. So that's a little about White Tombs. The Black Minute is the second book in the series. Oh, by the way, White Tombs is actually a biblical saying from Matthew in the Bible about how some people are white and clean on the outside and dark and decaying like a grave on the inside. So all the titles have a meaning as well. The Black Minute is from a Robert Browning poem about the moment of death, when you supposedly see nothing before the light and heaven and so on. But I wanted to write, when I was a principal, I had a lot of Hmong students. Are you familiar with the Hmong from Laos, the community? We have a huge population, depending on statistics. It's either the first or second largest Hmong population in the country here in the St. Paul and in the cities. And I had a lot of those kids in my school, and the vast majority of them were really wonderful kids. But I decided to do a book about that community and focus on the murder of a young Hmong girl on Harriet Island. And so I met with the Metro Gang Task Force, Kevin Navarro, that is no longer in existence, and Sergeant Ritz Straka, who was the gang, head of the gang units for St. Paul PD at the time. And they gave me some great information. I also learned about, and I knew some of the Hmong culture, but I also wanted to, if you're familiar at all, our funerals are like a day, right? You go, you have the funeral. The Hmong funerals are 3 days, all right? It's a 3-day affair, and there's food, and it's a long process before the burial itself. And the problem in St. Paul, or the problem in the cities, was to get a funeral home, tie that funeral home up for 3 days. I mean, it's unfortunately, it's a business and it's busy. So, St. Paul built a funeral home, two actually, together for Hmong funerals. They use. But what I learned also is that Hmong cannot be buried with any metal in their body. All right, I didn't know that at the time, but Bob McAdam, who runs a funeral home in St. Paul, I met with him through a friend who had a boat down on Raspberry Island there, near Harriet Island, and Bob has a boat too, and remember, he's a funeral director. His boat's name is called the Lucky Stiff. So, sense of humor in that business. But Bob told me about the metal in all of it, in the teeth, everything has to be taken out. No zippers, nothing when they're buried. Well, I jotted that down, and that becomes a key plot point in the Black Minute later on. I didn't know it at the time, but you get this information, you file it away, you write it down, and who knew. I also toured 3M, because 3M is in this book, and many of the places that Santana goes in the book or books are real places. Other places I'll fictionalize because maybe they're shown in a negative light, something like that. So a lot of the restaurants, I was at a Valley bookseller in Stillwater, Minnesota, had a 25-year celebration at the Lowell Inn a couple weeks ago on a Saturday evening, and they invited 40 authors from Minnesota to be there. And so I went, and they had champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and it was a very nice affair. And then they had our books, and people could come and get the book, and we'd sign them. And I was going up to the bar. I think it was maybe my second glass of champagne. I kind of lost my, but anyway, I was going up the bar, and I hear somebody calling my name, and I come over, and he said, I love all your books. I just finished The Darkness on It Late. I love them. When's your next book coming out? Which is always a great thing when you just put one out. You just don't turn them out every month. So I said, well, probably another year or so. But he said, a friend of mine, J.D. Franke, owns the Strip Club. And now that's not a strip club, it's a restaurant in St. Paul, a very good restaurant, Strip Steak, right? Yeah. Okay, and it sits right up on the hill near Metropolitan State College overlooking St. Paul. And it used to be this old speakeasy. And they got a winding staircase that goes up, and they got a beautiful bar downstairs and seats upstairs as well. And I put that in the book because Santana goes there with a lady he's dating at the time called Grace Chandler, and they have dinner there. And he said, I showed this to J.D. And J.D.'s one of the premier chefs in the Twin Cities. I think he owns 3 restaurants. And so he showed me on his iPhone. He had the cover and then the page. He took a picture of and sent it. So it was all around. They were tweeting all this in St. Paul about J.D.'s restaurant being in the books. So people like that, I think, about the series, that they recognized a lot of the places. And I interviewed, because there's a scene at 3M, I interviewed a couple of people at 3M as well. Then I talked with a former Stillwater prison guard, because Santana has to go to Stillwater prison to interview this convict who was convicted of this crime, and Santana's not sure he's guilty of it. So they do the interview. So again, you want to try and get it as accurate as you can.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yes.
What I wanted to mention to you is that book created an empathy in my heart for the Hmong people. And because of the way you dealt with the characters, not knowing any Hmong people, I felt now I would be a little more comfortable meeting them and appreciating them. So that's what it was a side part to your book, besides the mystery.
Thanks. Yeah, they're wonderful, wonderful people. We actually have, my wife is a teacher in St. Paul. She teaches Spanish, and we have and she's got a lot of ex-students, from Hispanic culture and Hmong and so on. But we have a couple of Karen kids from Burma that come and help clean the house every couple of weeks. They're going to school and making money part-time, so we pay them to do that. if you're familiar with the Karen as well, the Burma. And what happened with those kids was that when the government was overthrown in Burma, it's Myanmar now, and they slaughtered a lot of the Karen. And in fact, one of the girls that comes, she carried, and she was about 12 or 13 at the time, carried her youngest sister across the river, Mekong River, while they were shooting and killing. And that's the memories that some of these kids have. So it's amazing the resiliency and that these kids can overcome a lot of this stuff that's happened at the young age, and seeing people killed and so on. In White Tombs, one of the themes there deals with illegal immigration. I tell the story of Angelina Torres, who's a suspect in one of the murders, and she tells her story about coming across the border with the coyotes, and they pay them to take them across the border. Well, most of the young girls are raped, and there's nothing they can do about it. And the boys, and my wife, when she was teaching a lot of these kids, would have these kids journal in the stories these kids told when they were young. And the boys, it was terribly hard on the males as well, because they couldn't help. If it was even if it wasn't a family member, they couldn't intervene, because they know they'd get killed if they said anything. So they just had to sit and listen, knowing that their sister or their mother or maybe someone else was, what was happening to them. So again, those stories, and to live with that is really something. So the Black Minute deals with the Hmong, bad weeds never die, which is a very famous Colombian saying, mala hierba no muere, okay? It's weeds, you get rid of one weed, you get another one, comes the same with bad guys, right? You get rid of one, there's always another one to take their place, whether it's in the cartels or whatever it is. So part of that book, it deals basically with an adoption scam from Colombia, what's happening with the babies that are coming from Colombia, and Santana goes to Colombia in that book, and so part of that, the mid part of that book is in Colombia, as is the backstory in White Tombs, and part of White Tombs is in Mexico. So, but the story that you mentioned to the large group over there was, after I wrote this book, any of you know where Once Upon a Crime is in Minneapolis? It's probably the premier bookstore, mystery bookstore. They sell nothing but mysteries and thrillers. That's what they do. You can't get anything else in there. And it was given the Raven Award a few years ago for the best mystery bookstore in the country. Pat and Frobach and Gary Schultz own it, and actually they're about to sell it now because they're retiring. I dedicated the Black Minute to those two people because they're just wonderful people, to authors, and so I've done all my book launches there. But I got an email from Pat, she sent out this blanket email to Minnesota authors and said, a woman by the name of Rosie Schluter is looking for a crime novelist to come down to their triad in Cannon Falls and speak about their, about crime novel and so on. So, any of you are interested, email her. So I emailed Rosie and told her, a little bit about what I was writing, and I also said, by the way, a Pasofino horse, which horses come from Puerto Rico and Colombia. There are different lines of Pasofinos, but I said I wrote about a Pasofino ranch or farm in Cannon Falls. Well, lo and behold, what I find out, she emails me back and she says, that's my ranch. So I didn't know that at the time, because my wife and I went down and took some pictures and so on. I mean, I said, I'm not going to go bother the people. Hey, I'm writing a book, can I look at your... but I knew Pasofinos were raised here because I'd been to the state fair. And, you should tell, you all know what how it's different than a regular gait of a horse? Well, it's got a four beat walk, all right, and it's naturally bred in the breed. Yeah, and it doesn't trot. So when you ride, and I've ridden them in Colombia, when you ride those horses, my wife said her father used to ride the Pasofinos with a cup of coffee and just drink the coffee, because it's not like you're going like this, like a regular trot for a horse. And so it's such a smooth ride, and they use them up in the coffee plantations and so on and so forth, and they're beautiful horses. So who knew? And here I am again. So
You did a good job explaining.
yeah, it's just, like I say, it's just an incredibly, because if you've ever ridden a horse, never ridden a horse before, you know how you're bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. And
When they get excited, they can buck too, so I think
yeah,
the same in any horse.
right, they are a horse, absolutely. Yeah, right, exactly. A horse is a horse. So, I can't tell you how many interesting people I've met through this whole process. Bone Shadows, the fourth book. Bone shadows actually is a real term. Bone shadows, when people die and get cremated, not everything is fine ash to begin with, so what's left of the calcium and so on are called bone shadows. That's where that title comes from. So that's crushed and brought down. So this actually won the Midwest Book Award for Best Mystery of the Year in 2013. It deals with the murder of an Iraqi war vet. They found him drowned in the river in Mississippi, and it looks like just a drowning, but again, as Santana begins to investigate, there's much more to it than that. It also deals with post-traumatic stress disorder, which Santana has due to what happened to him as a kid. And so the nightmares and the trauma and that sort of thing. And so I did a lot of research and talked to some vets and just to get the idea of what they have to go through in that situation. But the premise of the novel is basically, because there are drugs now that they're experimenting with. Imagine, for example, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder and you have nightmares and you can't sleep and you're remembering all these things from war or from an experience on the job, and you could be offered a drug that would take that away. However, there would also be the possibility that it would erase some of your other memories, that it might change your personality. You might not be who you are now, right? That's the dilemma. Would you do it? Would you take the drug, erase that memory, but it might change you as the person you are. So that's one of the problems with the research that they're dealing with, that it's very hard to specifically target certain memories without targeting other memories as well. So that's one of the issues that Santana has to deal with. One of my favorite authors is Michael Connelly, and have you ever read Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch novels? Connelly said that a good crime novel is not just about how the detective works on a case, it's how the case works on a detective. And I think that's what I attempt to do because, working in homicide, obviously, I've never done that. But talking with the individuals, you look at the most violent scenes, the worst of human conduct, the worst in society, and you have to do that almost on a daily basis. And Mike mentioned in the other about the suicide rate. Well, rates of alcoholism, rates of divorce, suicide. It's a tough job, and particularly if you're in homicide, where you see that time and time and time again. So those are the, it's just not the plot, it's just not the story itself. It's some of these other things that police have to deal with. Death's Way came out 2 years ago, or 2014, I guess. That deals with the drug heroin trafficking from Costa Rica into the Twin Cities. 2 weeks after I wrote this book came out, there was a raid in Minneapolis where they caught 3 MS-13 Mara Salvatruchas, which is one of the worst gangs in the country and the most violent. Fortunately, most of them are in California and other, not necessarily here, but they had come up because 3 of the I don't know, what do you want to say, partners or young people who were selling the drugs. They thought they were cheating them. So they tortured them, cut off fingers and so on, and the police came, and they caught 2 of them, but 1 escaped, and they're not sure if he's back if he went to California or he's back across the border. Again, a lot of the themes and a lot of the things I talk about are things that are actually happening in the news. Death's Way also it has a little element of reincarnation in it, and I wanted to learn more about the Hindu community and found out there's over 100,000 Hindus in the Twin Cities. I didn't know that, in the state of Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. And there's also a beautiful Hindu temple that was built in Maple Grove, Minnesota. So my wife and I got a tour of the temple, and it's out in the middle of what used to be a soybean field way out there, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. If you go to my website, and on my author table I have bookmarks, and you can go to it, and there's a lot of photos of these places here and in Columbia, and there's photos of the temple too. So I learned an awful lot, studying that and going through that book as well. And then we come to, do we come to the next one? Yeah, whoops. Yeah, the research for The Darkness Hunter, which is my latest book that came out in September. I had been reading in the paper about the conflict down in this area in Red Wing and across the border in Wisconsin about the use of silica sand. Now, silica sand, as I found out from Tony Runkle, the chief geologist at the University of Minnesota, who I got a hold of. I heard him on NPR one day talking, and I emailed him and asked if I could talk to him about this, and he was wonderful. He gave me some great information for the book. But that silica sand, this is where it is, and they use that particular sand for fracking, for the oil, because it's a different shape, and they use it for the drills and that sort of thing to get the oil out of the ground. And obviously, as I learned here or in Red Wing and some of the places in Wisconsin as well, there's a great debate between the environmentalists and the oil and fracking industry, who, are they going to tear down the bluffs, or if they dig, what's going to happen to the scenic beauty? Are they going to fix things up before they leave? That sort of thing. And I live in Woodburn. We actually have a fracking plant in Woodbury, which down 94 towards, I didn't know that at the time, where they take these sand. And so I started researching this and talked with Tony, and then I knew I wanted to have some scenes down here in Red Wing. And in the book, Santana comes down here to pick up a suspect. It's a Native American girl from the Prairie Island community is found murdered in St. Paul. All right, they find her body, and the suspect is her boyfriend, Clay Buck, and so he's caught down in Red Wing, and Santana and his partner drive down to pick him up. And I wanted to tour the Law Enforcement Center and Goodhue County Law Enforcement Center, so Rosie and Paul set it up. We toured the facility. Mark Bolster showed us around. I met Pat Thompson, the captain and criminal investigation unit. I had some questions that Tom Woolner helped me with as I was writing the book. Lieutenant Lee Edwards, he's the former homicide commander for the Minneapolis Police Department. I have lunch every so often, and I run things by him as far as details and that sort of thing. And then this book also deals with secret trusts and wills, and I didn't know anything about that. So one of my neighbor's sons is one of the experts in Minnesota. I didn't know that either, on secret trusts and wills, and so is Chad Rogum, and so he has an office in St. Cloud. So I contacted him, and he gave me lots of information that I used in the book to make sure that it's right. I didn't mention also in Bad Weeds Never Die, orchids play a big part. What's the state flower? Great class. Okay, that's an A+. Yeah, the lady slipper. I knew that about orchids, and I knew that a lot of the orchids came from Colombia. So I called the Orchid Society of Minnesota, and I told them I was writing this novel and I needed some information, and could I talk to someone? And they said, oh, you have to talk to Jerry Fisher. He owns Orchids Limited in Plymouth, Minnesota, and he's an expert, one of the world's experts on orchid. I said, great. So I called him and explained what I was looking for, and he said, why don't you come on up? So I went up to see him one day, and we spent a few hours, and he went through the whole piece on the different kinds of orchids, and he actually has an orchid named after him called the Fisherie, which he discovered on the border of Ecuador and Colombia. So who knew? So when the book came out and I sent he and his wife a copy, and a few weeks later she wrote back and she said, oh, I'm not a big crime reader, mystery reader, but she said, I loved your book. I couldn't sleep at night. But she said, you got all the information about the orchids correct. So I said, yes, I was really happy. I was really happy about that because, you want to try to be as accurate as you can with that. So again, each of the books, I think that, I don't know if I have another slide. Oh yeah, I wanted to show the, yeah, and again, you can't see much there, but that's the cover for the Darkness Hunter, which that's supposed to be Red Wing. And if you see the book cover on the table, there's a Thunderbird kind of imposed in the back. Yeah, there it is right there, yeah. Because there's, it does have a Native American theme. It was interesting, the cover designer that did that, I sent them some information. I said, this is kind of like what I'd like, and I found out later, she said, oh yeah, Thunderbird, she said, but that's not the kind that the Sioux would use. She was Native American, so she said, I'll design one that's the best representation of that. So who knew that? So anyway, how about questions? Do you have some questions here? Yes?
Not a question, but if you read Bad Weeds Never Die, and you see this lovely young woman, assassin from Colombia, riding a black Pasofino horse across the hill. We have a black Pasofino horse. I ride it, but she flips her.
That was Rose.
But what's so cute is that one of our police officers said, when he heard about it, he said, gee, now we're probably going to have to come out with a shovel and start digging because of
I buried a mosquito horse with the body underneath.
Yeah.
We did bury one that year with it.
Yeah,
It was exactly the same year, it was creepy. Yeah. No bodies.
The Colombians, the drug dealers, oftentimes, there's actually a wonderful series on Netflix that Netflix produced called Narcos, and it's the story of Escobar's rise to power in Colombia. And it's just wonderfully acted, but they have caletas which had so much money that they couldn't launder it fast enough. So they started burying it. And that's where that came from, that a lot of the Colombians, the Mexicans, the drug lords, they bury things on their property or somebody else's property. So they, and then they, in Escobar's case, they had one guy that had a map, and he had all of the places where all of this money was buried. So if they ever wanted to go back and get it, they knew where everything was, and they could dig it up. So that's where they... Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also in that book, Santana has to get information off a computer. And so I met with Greg McDonald, who's the computer analyst for the St. Paul Police Department, and he showed me the software and they use for phones and computers. So again, unless you crush your hard drive and destroy it literally, it's all there. Even though you delete all that information, it's still in the space, and they have the software and technology. They can get it. Okay. Question? Yeah.
I have a son who's an educator. He has a master's degree and a degree in administration. Is your job today more lucrative than his? He would like to write young adult.
Yeah, well, I think most authors would tell you to stick with his first career and use that as a side job. Yeah, and always have, because it's very difficult. There's a lot of competition, and it's very hard. I mean, you always hear these stories about Patterson or something, they're making millions and millions, or Stephen King. Yeah, well, that's not the majority of writers. Majority of writers are teachers or bartenders or whatever. They're doing something besides writing.
Are your books, do you have to read them sequentially?
That's a good question. They're considered standalone. Okay, there's a lot of continuing characters in the book. Besides Santana, Reiko Tanabe, the medical examiner, appears. Tony Novak, the crime scene tech. They're in all the books. So there's a lot of characters that continue in the books. Sometimes. But if the whole backstory of what happened to him is told in much more detail in the first book, but it's referenced in all the other books. Okay. I didn't know it at the time, but the first 3 books, I sort of now see like a trilogy, because at the time when he left Columbia at 16, he had to leave his sister behind. Okay. And he doesn't know what happened to her. So in Bad Weeds, for the case, he goes back to Columbia, knowing that the Cali cartel is looking for him, and while he's investigating, he search for his sister. So that's sort of played out in those first 3 books. But again, you could start, you could start with the latest and then go back if you liked them.
Can we find them anywhere, like Amazon?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, small bookstores. If they don't have it in stock, they can get it for you. Yeah.
I always wondered that if it made a difference to the writer, like if you get more cut, depending on where a person might have from.
Actually, most writers I make more money on the ebooks actually than I do on the print books. Yeah, yeah. And the ebooks are, so if you have a Kindle or a Nook or whatever it is, you can download them too. But I mean, I still like the print. I mean, a lot of people like to hold a book in there. Plus, you can't sign a Kindle, although they'll probably come up with something like that at some point in time. Yeah, yeah, a little kind of, because with this, some of you bought books and used your credit card, with the swipe, and you got to write your finger, use your index finger to sign. So I assume at some point they'll develop something that you can use that. But it's still nice to have a print book. And right now I'm doing a lot of Albion, Mankato, the Barnes & Noble there on Saturday. I go to Iowa, I go to Arizona, Wisconsin. So this next 3 months is very, very busy on the next weekends. But it's good busy because I meet a lot of interesting. I met when I was in Madison, Wisconsin a couple years back. I'm going to forget his name. It's J.D. something. This guy comes in. He's got a cowboy hat. He's got boots on. He's got jeans. And he comes up to me, and he's got this handlebar mustache. And he introduces himself. What was it? It's J.D. Gosh, Simmons. Was it Simmons? No, maybe not. Anyway, he was a homicide detective in Chicago for years. And he said, "What do you got here?" And I told him about my books, and he said, "Well, I'll take that First White Tombs, And he said, "You and I ought to sit down and talk sometime." He was on TV. He's been on Oprah. He's been on, he's quite the character. He told me one time he woke up. It was early in the morning in the winter, and his neighbor called him and said, "JD, I think you ought to go out and check your front lawn." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "There's a body out in your front lawn." And they went out, and he went out there, and sure, they had buried he was in a gang task force or something, and this was a message, to lay off what he was doing. And so he changed his address even though he didn't move, and then his commander found out about it. So you can't put a phony address in here. Then he said, "Well, what would you do if, after that?" So yeah, he had some fun stories. So it was.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Julie, you had another question.
Do you put yourself in the book? I mean, are you one of the characters in the book?
I am Santana. No. I really, Santana's just, a fictionalized version of a Colombian. My wife is, my Colombian muse, And even though I've been there many times, it's still, you know, she knows what culturally what they would do. And Colombia is very much of a mixture of Catholicism and superstition. And so the magical realism, like from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, all of that. So Santana's a big believer in intuition and dreams and dream interpretation. So he keeps a journal, a dream journal, and he writes down all his dreams. And that's played out in a lot of the books as he tries to work out the case.